When Ford announced the Mustang Mach-E, it raised an uproar within the community. How dare they use the Mustang brand with an all-electric vehicle when it's traditionally known as a petrol-guzzling muscle car? Nevertheless, this shows a new era for the automaker. And in this review, we're going to be seeing if the Mustang Mach-E is worth its price tag, because in the UK, it starts from £42,500. Now, the manufacturer has used the Mustang branding, and frankly, you can see why from the exterior design. It's really got that muscle car type of vibe, specifically from the front and the rear profile. Personally, I think it looks fantastic, and it just incites that kind of aggressive design. And yes, I know purists for those ICE based vehicles won't like the covered front grille, but it does make sense in terms of aerodynamics and efficiency. However, from the side profile, I'm not too taken by Ford's design over here. 18-inch alloys sit as standard. You can get 19 or 20-inch alloys in the more expensive trims, but the plastic wheel arches and the side skirts kind of detract from the overall design. Although it should be mentioned that if you're going to be spending over £60,000, you can get the Mach-E GT, which comes with body-coloured wheel arches and side skirts. One might have hoped for that to come down and filter to the cheaper models, but alas, that's not the case. As for the colour of the vehicle, it comes as black as standard in terms of what you can see on the video, but if you want a white finish, it'll come in at £800, or if you want more of the premium colours, which actually do stand out quite a bit, such as the blue or the red finish, it'll cost a whopping £1,150. Now, on the subject of its exterior design, I do have to quickly reference its door handles, because they're slightly different from other vehicles out there on the market and might throw off a few customers, at least at first. Now, at the front, it's very intuitive. You have a door release button, and just under it you've got a little handle which allows you to easily open the door. However, the same couldn't be said at the rear of the cabin, whereby the little door handle is missing, and as such, for you to access the rear of the cabin, it means that you have to put your fingers between the door and the actual frame of the vehicle, which might raise a few safety risks, although one should say that here you can't close the door if it's just been released, because it's got a mechanism which prevents it from shutting and therefore being affected by, let's say, high gusty winds. And now we get on to its interior design, and here I do quite like the look of the dashboard and the seat upholstery, although one should say that it's not as plush or as premium feeling as the likes of the Mercedes EQA, the Volvo XC40 Recharge Twin Pro, or let's say the Audi Q4 e-tron, just to name a few of its competitors. Nevertheless, in comparison to the likes of the Kia e-Niro, Hyundai Kona Electric, I think most will be pleased. Now, when it comes to a practicality point of view, I do like the fact that Ford have integrated physical buttons around the steering wheel, which is a definite plus point. And as for the rotary dial found towards the center console, it's really intuitive for you to go between, let's say, reverse, neutral and park, and of course drive. And we'll touch upon L mode, which is the button found on this rotary dial further down in this review, specifically in terms of regenerative braking. Now, as we move our attention towards the center planted 15.5-inch display, here there's a few things I should mention. First off, in terms of its design, it's flat and therefore it's not angled towards the driver, which I feel is somewhat of a missed trick from Ford, specifically when it comes to the overall practicality. Say, for example, the climate controls are all virtual, and therefore when you're on the move, it's just a little bit, well, less intuitive as a driver to adjust certain controls. On that note, the dial that is positioned towards the lower portion of the screen is only used for volume. You can't use it to access, let's say, your fan speed or climate controls. And even if you were to press on this dial, it doesn't do a secondary function. So, for example, you can't mute your media by pressing on it, which I feel is, again, something that Ford could have potentially looked at and or thought about when it came to the overall design of this display. Now, as for the software side of stuff, I think it's pretty responsive, and I really do like the layout that Ford have integrated over here. It's very intuitive to use and very easy to get your head around. However, when it comes to certain integrations, so for example with Android Auto in my case, which are both supported in a wired and wireless format, and that is also including Apple CarPlay, should I mention, here I felt that Android Auto sometimes did lag and or created problems. So for example, sometimes it wouldn't even launch up, and or if it would launch up and I would to disconnect the phone from the infotainment system and therefore stop the communication between phone and car, it would just freeze in terms of it operating, which is something I haven't noted in other cars, and kind of took me by surprise and left me somewhat disappointed. Now, on a more positive note, I do like the fact that Ford have integrated turn-by based navigation data on the instrument cluster, which is a 10.2-inch horizontally planted display, which is found behind the steering wheel, of course. And here the instrument cluster also provides you all the key information that you need. So, for example, your range and or your speed. But the only thing I should mention here in terms of the instrument cluster, that is that the positioning of the steering wheel, at least for me in terms of my driving height, I felt that it takes away the top portion of the screen and therefore isn't as well planted and or as intuitive to see when you're driving. But of course that is very subjective, but I just thought to highlight it in my review. Now, similarly, there is no use of a head-up display, which is another complaint I've had from, let's say, the likes of the Tesla Model 3, which doesn't have a head-up display, nor does it have as an option, and the same case could be said about the Mustang Mach-E. Now, before proceeding on the use of technology, I should also reference the audio system. Now, for those who are subscribed, you'll know I do dedicated audio reviews, and indeed there's one for the Ford Mustang Mach-E. You'll be up on your pop banner, down description below, or indeed in the pinned comments. And if you're not subscribed, by the way, do consider subscribing for more detailed reviews like this one. It'd be greatly appreciated. Now, what I'll say is the stock configuration is somewhat average, at least in the standard range rear-wheel drive model. I didn't really experience a great audio prowess, specifically if you compare it to the class-leading Polestar 2, Tesla Model 3, or let's say the Volvo XC40 Recharge Twin Pro, all of which do a phenomenal job of producing a great audio reproduction. But that's not the case with the standard setup. But on the plus side, you can upgrade it to the B&O 10-speaker 560 watt system instead. But this comes in at a pretty penny at £3,600, although it's worth bearing in mind that does include all a variety of different options. Suffice to say, if you want some more information about the audio system, do check out the dedicated audio review, because I get into a lot more detail about the audio system and its configuration. So now we get onto storage within the cabin, and here there is a pretty large compartment area at the front of the center console, both of which are treated with non-slip material, and therefore means you can place, let's say, loose valuables and or a smartphone. You can also wireless charge your smartphone on the top bay as well, which is a definite plus point. A Type-C and Type-A ports can be found towards the front of the center console to provide power and or to connect up to the infotainment system. Further down from this, you've got two cup holders, and if we move towards the armrest area, you've then got a retractable cover, which also reveals an area where there's a 12-volt socket, which provides extra power to a different device. And of course here you do have a little compartment to place, let's say, a wallet and or a small size purse. Now, elsewhere you do have a little compartment for sunglasses at the front of the cabin, although you can place something else if you so wish. And then you've got the glove compartment and the door bins. Now, the front two door bins are large enough, although the design of them isn't that great, at least not for a 500 milliliter bottle. As for the rear door bins, they're unsurprisingly a little bit more limited, although on the plus side, if you were not to use the rear middle seat, you can reveal two cup holders found towards the rear armrest. There is, for convenience as well, a USB Type-C port and a USB Type-A port found towards the rear of the center console. So what about when it comes to its boot? Well, first off, I should mention in terms of operating it in the standard range rear-wheel drive model, it's a manual tailgate, which is slightly a shame. If you want a electric tailgate, you'll have to go for the all-wheel drive models instead. Nevertheless, in terms of its design, its hatchback design that is, it's great because I'm just under 6 foot and I've got no problems whatsoever when it comes to loading in and out goods. Similarly, in terms of the boot capacity, I think it will suffice for most individuals. It's 402 litres when the seats are propped up, and if you were to pop down the seat, this figure extends to 1,420 litres. That makes it similar to the likes of the Kia e-Niro and the Volvo XC40 Recharge Twin Pro, although it's much smaller than the likes of the VW ID4, Skoda Enyaq iV, or let's say the Audi e-tron or Audi Q4 e-tron. Now, what Ford have integrated, however, is nice underfloor storage, which is great to place your charging cables, and also in terms of the seats, they fold flat, although it should be mentioned that you've got a 60-40 split only, so therefore you don't have the more convenient 40-20-40 split that some of its rivals offer. Nevertheless, Ford does integrate a front storage space, and it's pretty large, 81 litres to be specific. The only thing to be mindful about here is to operate it, you have to release the latch from within the cabin, which is not exactly as intuitive, and in terms of closing it, you do require quite a bit of force, in other words, to slam it down. Unfortunately, it's not electric either, and therefore makes it a little less convenient when it comes to accessing goods or indeed, let's say, your charging cables from the front of the vehicle. Now, with storage capacity ticked off, what about when it comes to comfort? Now, the rear of the cabin, you've got plenty of legroom. I've got no issues whatsoever as someone who's just under 6 foot. Although headroom isn't quite as sufficient, I think if you're a 6'4", 6'7", I think you'll feel a little bit hemmed in and or would need to slouch on your seats. The rear middle seat is also a little bit stiffer, which is almost no surprise, but on the plus side, when it comes to seating comfort, you can put your feet down flat because there's no transmission tunnel, given we're talking about an all-electric vehicle that's built on an all-electric powertrain. Now, at the front of the vehicle, you have 6-way manually adjustable seats. It's a shame not to see electric seats that come as standard, but this does come as standard in the all-wheel drive models of the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Now, there is heated seats, heated steering wheel and a heated windshield that all come as standard on the plus side, which is definitely going to bolster the overall experience, specifically in colder climate times in the UK or indeed elsewhere, and therefore makes you feel all that bit more cozier. Now, with all of that in mind, how does the Ford Mustang Mach-E drive? Now, first off, I have to talk about the visibility. Now, at the front and the side, it's perfectly great. I have no problems whatsoever, although the only thing to be mindful about is that the A-pillars are relatively large, similar to what you would find in the Tesla Model 3. Now, as for its rear, it's pretty easy to peer over, but the only thing to be mindful about is that when it does rain, the top portion doesn't get cleaned from the rear view wiper. And yes, indeed, you do get a rear view wiper, which isn't present in some of its competitors, such as the Polestar 2 or the Tesla Model 3. Nevertheless, Ford does integrate front and rear parking sensors and a rear view camera that come all as standard. If you want to bolster the experience, you'll have to go for the all-wheel drive model, which has 3D surround cameras, a panoramic glass roof, and also active park assist, which just gives you a little bit more peace of mind when you're doing complex parking maneuvers. The only thing to be mindful about over here is that if you go for the Ford Mustang Mach-E GT, the panoramic glass roof will not come included, and as such you'll have to purchase it as an additional option. So let's get on to the driving element of it. Now, first off, I do have to talk about cabin noise, whereby the vehicle does incur some from the tyres and also a bit of wind deflecting off the A-pillars. I go into a lot more detail about this in my detailed audio review, so do check that down in the description below. But let's talk about the drive modes. Now, through the infotainment system, you can select between Whisper, Active and Untamed. Now, Whisper is your equivalent eco mode, which means that the accelerator pedal feels quite mushy but then increases on efficiency, while Active, which is one of the modes that I preferred, gives you a nice sort of blend between performance and efficiency, while Untamed is the equivalent of Sport mode and therefore gives you a more responsive accelerator pedal and better steering input because the steering wheel tightens up a little bit. Now, on that note, the steering wheel is nowhere near as good in terms of that driver's feel as its competitors. For example, the Audi Q4 e-tron, the BMW iX3, the Volvo XC40 Recharge Twin Pro, the Polestar 2 or the Tesla Model 3, and to an extent, even the VW ID4 have got a better one-to-one driving feel and aspect to them. Now, this means that you might think that, okay, well, Ford have potentially tailored this more towards city driving and therefore it's not exactly meant to be lobbing around corners at speed. And there you will be wrong as soon as you start driving the Ford Mustang Mach-E, because the suspension setup is ridiculously stiff. Now, it does have its pros, whereby when you are going on those country roads, you're going to feel a little bit more confident when cornering, and therefore means that the car doesn't suffer from as much body roll as larger size SUVs. But on the flip side, it means that when you're potting around town, you're going to feel every speed bump, every pothole and every anomaly on the road. And I can tell you from having tested around 50 odd different electric vehicles, that is potentially the worst feeling electric car that I've driven to date, which isn't something I was expecting to say about a Mustang, let alone a fully electric Mustang. Now here, I'm not really sure why Ford have gone this route, in other words, stiffening up the suspension so much that it becomes uncomfortable. So much so that even your lower back might start hurting if you keep going on rougher terrain. And frankly, I just think that they've gone a step too far. Now, I should be mindful over here that I'm making the comment around the regular Mustang Mach-E. If you go for the GT, you do have an adaptive suspension, but I haven't tested that, so I can't comment on that. But equally, that is a vehicle that costs, well, over over £60,000. Now on that note, the GT model has an all-wheel drive system and therefore gives you a little bit more confidence when you're going on rougher terrain or trickier conditions. Now the model we have on review, however, is a rear-wheel drive system, and as a result means that, well, it's got a single rear-mounted motor. Now this perfectly leads me onto performance, because here you've got 198 kilowatts of power, 265 horsepower and 430 newton meters of readily available torque. I had it tested from 0 to 60 miles an hour in 7.2 seconds. Now that might seem plenty fast for a lot of individuals, although when you compare it to its competitors from the likes of Polestar, Tesla, Volvo, among many others, here the other vehicles do a far better job of providing more increased and bettered performance, and indeed give you a faster 0 to 60 time, and as a result just give you, well, just a bit more excitement when you're putting your foot down to the metal. Now as for top speed, you've got 111 miles per hour, which again should suffice for most, although in comparison to some other vehicles, such as let's say from the likes of Tesla, it doesn't get up to 140 or 160 miles an hour, which is something that you might want if you're driving on unrestricted roads. So its performance can't quite match its rivals. So what about when it comes to electric range? Well, here Ford has a massive battery pack, at least in the all-wheel drive or longer range models. Here you do have up to 98 kilowatt hour battery pack, which net sits around 91, and whereas with the standard range models you've got a 75 kilowatt hour battery pack, which nets 71 kilowatt hours. Now what does this mean? Well, in my mixed driving test, as I do with all the vehicles that I test, I found that the vehicle netted only a measly 180 to 200 miles on a full charge. Now, by comparison, the Polestar 2 and Volvo XC40 Recharge Twin Pro netted between 200 to 250 miles. The likes of the VW ID3 even netted around 230 miles. The rear-wheel drive Tesla Model 3, 230 to 250 miles. The Tesla Model 3 long-range model netted over 310 miles. The Skoda Enyaq iV noted around 300 miles, while the likes of the VW ID4, Hyundai Kona Electric, Kia Soul EV and Kia e-Niro all netted around 260 miles, and the same could be said about the Audi Q4 e-tron. Hopefully you're understanding what I'm trying to say over here is that the Ford Mustang Mach-E's range is pretty poor, specifically considering that you're looking at a car that costs over £42,500. One might have expected a range hitting north of 250 miles, or at least being closer to the 270 mile claim that the manufacturer has. Now what I do like, however, is the fact that Ford has integrated a one-pedal driving approach, and this means via regenerative braking you lift off from the accelerator pedal and come to a complete stop. For example, now we're going 20 miles an hour and I just lift off and it just pretty much comes to a stop without me having to touch the brake pedal, which I quite like. Now you can disable this feature through the infotainment system and it's very easy to do so. My only real complaint over here is that unlike a few other manufacturers, namely from let's say the Hyundai group or even the likes of let's say the Audi or BMW equivalents, that you can't customize the regenerative braking feel via the use of flappy paddles or let's say different settings through the infotainment system. Now there is another means of enabling one pedal driving, and that is specifically if you don't have let's say the option enabled through the infotainment system, and that's by pressing the L button found towards the rotary dial on the center console. Now the only way that this differs by the one pedal driving mode that you can enable through the display is that L mode is more tailored towards driving downhill, at least according to Ford. Other than that, there is no differences between the two. So if you have one pedal driving mode enabled through the infotainment system and you were to press the L button while you're driving normally, it's not going to make any difference whatsoever. So what about when it comes to recharging the Mustang Mach-E? Now the standard range models have 115 kilowatts of input, whereas the longer range models have 150 kilowatts of input. No matter which mode you choose from, in other words the battery packs, you will go from about 10 to 80% in roughly 38 minutes, which is plenty fast if you can find a rapid DC charger via the CCS input. If you were to opt for the 50 kilowatt input, which is a lot more frequent on at least UK highways, at least at the time of filming, here you'll find the vehicle goes from 10 to 80% in roughly 90 minutes. Now should you go for a 7 kilowatt input, this time does extend quite significantly to around 10 hours, and if you go for a 3-pin plug, you're going to be looking north of 35 hours. And finally we get on to safety and the driver assistance systems, and here what I will say is on the former, it was tested by Euro NCAP and scored scored a 5 out of 5 star rating, and you can see why when you look at the crash video. But I can't quite comment on that personally, but I can say that driver assistance systems are actually relatively impressive. Now here, the adaptive cruise control works a treat, and the same could be said about the lane departure and positioning assistance, which keeps you centered in the lane and gives you a bit of steering input as well to just make it all that bit easier when you're doing your motorway commutes. Now I should mention over here that in comparison to other vehicles, namely from the Volkswagen group, where you have to faff around with the infotainment system to disable this feature, you can simply disable it by pressing a button on the steering wheel. And the reason I point this out is because the system is enabled as standard each time you step inside the vehicle, even if you have previously disabled it in your last drive. Now the same praise can be given to the blind spot monitoring system and also the rear cross traffic alert, which just works a treat. My problem, however, with the overall safety systems is the pre-collision alert, which I felt was just overly sensitive. Now you can dial the sensitivity between low, medium and high, but even in its lowest mode, the vehicle just seemed to do emergency brake even though I was at a good distance from the vehicle in front. And just bearing this all in mind, I was commuting at roughly about 5 to 3 miles an hour in central London, and as a result made me, well, quite scared when the car was doing emergency brake, and also almost hindered the security because the car behind me almost shunted in the rear. And so this brings me on to my verdict. Will I recommend the Ford Mustang Mach-E? Well, given its price tag for the standard range rear wheel drive model, which starts from £42,500, it's quite hard to recommend, specifically if you can see what else is on there on the market. Take for example the saloon based class. You've got the Polestar 2 and the Tesla Model 3. To a stretch you can even look at the VW ID3. If you want something bigger and you're looking for an SUV, then you've got the likes of the Audi Q4 e-tron, the Volvo XC40 Recharge Twin Pro, the Mercedes EQA. You've got even the BMW iX3 if you really want that driver's feel. Then you've even got the likes of the Hyundai Kona Electric and the Kia e-Niro, all of which offer a very compelling option, and as such makes the Ford Mustang Mach-E look a little bit overpriced, specifically given the amount of range and performance and the features that you get. But of course that's just our opinion about the vehicle. We'll be intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comment section below. And of course, if you've liked this detailed independent review, definitely do drop a like and subscribe, as it's greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV, and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care and goodbye.